Hello and welcome to Welty at Home. We are the slow reading virtual book club that alternates works by Eudora Welty with works by authors who are connected to Welty in some way. And we've been reading and discussing in this series To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. This discussion today will focus on the window sections 11 through 16. I'm Jessica Russell. I'm the director of the Eudora Welty House and Garden. And for this series, we are joined by our guest moderator, Virginia Woolf scholar, Susan Harrison. She's the Eckerd College Professor of Rhetoric and the author of the book Eudora Welty and Virginia Woolf, Gender, Genre, and Influence. Susan will be co-leading discussions with our fearless leader, Dr. Suzanne Mars, Eudora Welty's friend and biographer and a professor emerita of Millsaps College. Remember, some housekeeping. This is going to be just your reminder that if you want to comment or ask a question, be sure to use the bottom of your screen and click the reactions button and choose the raise hand function. That's how we'll know that you're in line for a question or a comment. And be sure to glance over at the chat every now and then. There's a lot of great resources and links and discussions that get mentioned in the chat that we don't always have a chance to talk about in our discussion here. I'll also say I'm getting questions about the recordings. All these conversations are recorded, and the recording for each week is in your Friday Welty at Home newsletter. The first link that you get is the recording from the previous link. Then you get the Zoom link for the discussion that's live the next week. And if you're looking for a recording of an episode that was 2 or 3 weeks back, just keep scrolling down in that email, and we've got them all laid out for you in the reading schedule section. So just a quick reminder on how to get your recordings if you miss a session with us. And with that out of the way, Susan, shall we officially begin our discussion today?
Oh, let's do, because there is so much to talk about today. I mean, there is every time we read any Woolf, and I know that this is the slow reading group, but I feel like there's more to talk about here than we can possibly talk about today. And at this point, we are really getting further and further into the window. And it seems like a number of, I don't know, I was trying to figure out what to call them, tensions, oppositions, have started to come into perhaps clearer perspective. And I have a list, but I'll invite you all to add those that you're noticing. But in particular, in this week's readings, thinking about childhood and adulthood or maturity, children and adults. I think we see Woolf really playing with that tension. Obviously, male and female, masculinity and femininity. We've seen that growing throughout the reading so far. We have family life and academic life. And I'm not even sure that family life is the term I really wanted there, but just thinking about especially some of the differences that we see in section, I think it's section 12, where you have Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay talking about family, and Mrs. Ramsay looking at flowers, and Mr. Ramsay focusing about a foot above the flowers in his vision and his thinking. We also start to see unity and fragmentation as kinds of things pulling against one another, permanence and mutability, and inside and outside, and really thinking about inside the house and the garden, and then outside in section 14, we get, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, but I think it is only the second journey outside of the house and garden. We went to town with Mrs. Ramsay and Charles Tansley. And in this case, we have Paul and Minta and Andrew and Nancy taking their journey out to the cliffs and having a variety of quite different adventures in that scene. So there's just so much going on in what we read today. So I thought I might start the discussion by throwing out some passages that were really striking to me in this section and really evocative, and for us to talk about them. And the first one on page 62, I thought of this as the perfect Mother's Day passage to look at. It's at the quite close to the beginning of section 11. And this is Mrs. Ramsay. She's thinking it was a relief when they went to bed. For now, she need not think about anybody. She could be herself, by herself. And that was what now she often felt the need of, to think, well, not even to think, to be silent, to be alone, all the being and the doing, expansive, glittering, vocal, evaporated, and one shrunk with a sense of solemnity to being oneself, a wedge-shaped core of darkness, something invisible to others. And I'm sure that many of you, like me, marked that passage as you were reading it, and perhaps thought back to Lily Briscoe's painting, and that Mr. Banks was so puzzled by, that wedge-shaped core, that wedge shape that was Mrs. Ramsay reading to her son James. And so I wanted to ask how you understood that, what you thought about also the kind of limitlessness that she experiences then with the adventure to places she's never been, the Indian Plains. I mean, I just thought that was fascinating. So I'm just going to start today's discussion by really throwing that passage out there and hearing what your thoughts were about it. Yes, Ray.
Ray, you're muted.
I should know how to work this thing by now, but one thought I have is the different ways of being that are throughout the novel, and a very, for me, striking part of the novel. Just one little example is one of the daughters down at the seashore, where she plays with the waves and she becomes hypnotized by the waves. And this is a strange part of Mrs. Ramsay as well. And what is the wedge really about? And Ms. Ramsay has other ways of being that are very far from her husband.
Mm-hmm.
So that I can't call to mind all those and all the different ways of being that everybody does have, but that's what strikes me.
And you're right. That passage with Nancy in the pool is really fascinating. And I think we'll have to spend some time looking at that. And also with Mrs. Ramsay, I mean, a lot of the time she is expansive, glittering, vocal. I mean, those other ways of being that she even lists there. Harriet.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to your oppositions and my desire to look at this passage and then add from it in Weltian terms, love and separateness.
Yes.
The idea of, I mean, I think Woolf is really good on human isolation and the efforts to look at others with the hope of knowing or loving them. And I think the terms are a little bit different from Welty to Woolf, but I'm thinking when I think about love and separateness, the other set of terms I'm trying to work with is maybe isolation and looking, with the idea of looking being merging with thingness or with the other. Although looking is often diluted, it's often inaccurate, so we're back to separateness and the limitation of knowing the other.
Mm-hmm. I'm just thinking of how many passages in the novel involve Mr. and Mrs. Ramsay looking at each other. And we only get more of those as we go on through the
And
window.
looking at the natural world and, looking
Yeah,
at light, looking at the wave, and merging with it somehow. Yeah.
Yeah. Monica.
Well, and this isn't what I was going to say, but also the fact that Lily Briscoe defines marriage, says that must be what marriage is to a man and a woman looking at a girl with a ball.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about this passage, you're talking about the oppositions and the dualities. This seems to be kind of narrating what happens when you're trying to get to the other side of the opposition, right? All this busyness and movement and what it feels like to sit down, and how actually, even when you sit down, you're not still. And I love how throughout this passage, she's dinning, and that lovely little intrusion on the next page. Not as oneself did one find rest ever in her experience. She accomplished something here, something dexterous with her needles, but as a wedge of darkness. So I love, to me, this passage is narrating what happens when we're trying to get to the other side of that opposition.
Right. And I was just thinking also, Harriet, back to your looking. I mean, that's what the artist does. That's what Lily Briscoe does, and it's that looking that's trying to bridge somehow. Yeah. John.
Hey, what struck me about the passage was where it leads her at the end of that long paragraph.
Yeah.
And that it says, we are in the hands of the Lord. And then the next statement is, but instantly she was annoyed with herself for saying that. Who had said it? Not she. She had been trapped into saying something she did not mean. And then she continues that on into the next paragraph, where she's annoyed at her saying this about we're in the hands of the Lord. And she disagrees with her statement, though she doesn't know who said it. And just the way she keeps on coming back to that, and where she gets into just raising the question, is there a God? And if there is, how can we live in such an unjust world that we live in? And at least as far as I can tell, that's the first time that she's introduced that theme into the book. And some of the themes to me prior to that have been particularly with Mr. Ramsay, they seem to be some themes that are picayunish, and they don't address a large question, such as she's raised, and in that part of the chapter.
Why does she say it?
Well, I certainly don't know the answer to that. It seems to me it is. She says it because she knows there is so much injustice in the world, and one thing that she does work on when she goes into the village is trying to help poor people.
Right.
And that makes, because of that, and I can't remember if we've passed that. I think it was with the Hansley chapter. And we've already addressed that. And her changing her appearance at the top of the stairs before she goes into, to see whoever it is that she's talking with in that house. She's self-conscious of some things, but it may be, again, just because she is concerned, and I think genuinely concerned about helping people. She'd like to see a hospital on the island. And at least that's my recollection. I don't know if we've gotten to that yet. But that's what struck me about the wedge-shaped pie, that it leads her to just this very fundamental question about life.
Pearl.
Been so many minutes and thoughts since I first raised my hand. But first of all, I too mark this passage as just absolutely spot on what it's like to be a mother. If you're not
Right.
a mother, I was thinking, I was reading it on Mother's Day. I was thinking about my own parenting, about my daughters, my 6 grandchildren and how they're busy, and how this is you don't have a moment for yourself, and the minute you do think of a moment for yourself, you think of the thing that you hadn't done, or the thing still needs to be done, or the wish that you had that you weren't able to fulfill because the life intervened. So I think, to jump over to the end of the conversation thus far, that she says we're in the hands of the Lord, because she has just exhausted herself trying to figure out this whole psychological moment of herself and her thinking and the way she's living, that she lapses into the cliche-ish answer, and that's what she's so mad about. She can't let up the control to the Lord, whatever that represents to her. And I think the ideas of justice and what's unjust is very apropos, but I don't think that's at this moment. I mean, I think that's a larger world that she's sort of thinking about. But
Mhm.
this whole chapter 11 made me very sad, because to me it represents the impasse of Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey's communication. They cannot match their thoughts. They're what they see, what they want to do, what they want out of life. And no matter how hard Mrs. Ramsey works at it, she knows that he thinks he shouldn't have gotten married. He would have made better books. I mean, she falls back on sort of a martyrdom position, which she doesn't want to have either. But this impasse of communication was very sad to me.
Mhm. You know, it's so you just made me realize, and I hadn't really thought of it this way, but I'm not at all convinced he would have made better books had he not gotten married. I had never quite put it that way to myself. But Deborah.
I had just kind of I guess, simplistic response to that comment that she blurted out to herself.
Yeah.
But but she was, torn with all of these things that she needed to do as a mother, had to do as a mother, her constant focus on the needs of others, which is kind of the outside activity to herself internally, even though it's motivated, internally. But she caught herself speaking to herself in the outside social voice, or the more conventional voice.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it popped out in that context. And in the whole God conversation,
Mm-hmm.
embedded in this context of the discussion with her husband and, with herself about the Scottish and the English philosophers and blah, 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 blah. So it kind of fits too in kind of a philosoph, but I don't think it was philosophical when she said it. I think it was just this outburst of her social conventional voice. And she immediately pulled herself back. Wait, that's not what I believe.
Right. She calls it insincere. Yeah.
And she felt insincere.
Yeah.
Because she was, she's got the role of the mother, which is true and honest, but it takes her out of herself, inevitably.
Okay. All right, I'm going to move us to another passage. And I'm not getting us very far, I am afraid. This one's on page 63. And it follows right on the heels, but it comes before the hands of the Lord. It starts at the top of page 63, losing personality. One lost the fret, the hurry, the stir, and there rose to her lips always some exclamation of triumph over life when things came together in this peace, this rest, this eternity. And pausing there, she looked out to meet that stroke of the lighthouse, the long, steady stroke, the last of the three, which was her stroke. For watching them in this mood, always at this hour, one could not help attaching oneself to one thing, especially of the things one saw. And this thing, the long, steady stroke, was her stroke. And first of all, did any of you think of the end of the Wanderers?
Yes.
and the sword, the Medusa sword, you know,
The
in
three
three.
strokes. Yeah.
Yes, so the three strokes. And you know, so I'm curious what you make of, I mean, anybody who wants to talk some about Welty and the end of the Wanderers and those three strokes and these three strokes, but it's just an interesting passage in that at that point, Mrs. Ramsay is, you know, there's a sense of unity with the lighthouse and with the light, which is very different from looking at it in a distance and longing for it. So thoughts about this passage? Ray.
Thank you. I think of William Banks and his rapture. And that's only one of many, many strange ways of being. I wouldn't call them bad.
No.
The daughter looking in the pool and being hypnotized is another. Lily Briscoe with her art and her immersion in her art, or a trance. I think it was the word trance that was used.
Mm-hmm.
So I can't recall the others, but there are many, many occasions when the straight up style of Mr. Ramsay is, we're shown another way of being or knowing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I think about. Thank you.
And I just laughed at your use of the word strange. I mean, I think it is, you know, I think strange in the sense of almost otherworldly and unusual. And it just is fascinating. A little further down on that same page, she looked up over her knitting and met the third stroke. And it seemed to her like her own eyes meeting her own eyes, searching as she alone could search into her mind and her heart, purifying out of existence. And then it's that lie, or any lie, but the lie about the hands of the Lord. Harriet.
Oh, I've got so many thoughts now. I don't think I can speak. First of all, let me say this chapter is amazing. This is an amazing chapter.
Yes.
And I'm back to the idea of looking, and of, I love the idea of the wedge of darkness, losing personality, what we do when we retreat into ourselves. So I mean, I think another opposition here is solitude versus social life. But the thing that is going on here is losing personality and then merging into looking. And I'm thinking, and ultimately, you know, I think that I think of Mrs. Ramsay as are discovering her as something of a depressive, that she is somebody who deeply feels depressed over the things that Mr. Ramsay studies, but can be cheerful about, and at the same time, I think she achieves a kind of ecstasy in this chapter as she merges with the things that she's looking at. And thinking back when you said to think back to the end of the Wanderers, I'm thinking of not only of the three strokes, but also of opposites that are oppositions that are closer together than apart. hate and loving and isolation and merging and yeah.
Mhm. And here we have also the, I mean, the lighthouse is so interesting, following so close on the heels of the wedge of darkness. I mean, we've gone from darkness to light, and certainly that the focus on seeing, on looking, on vision there is fascinating. But even there, I mean, we have even just that very elemental darkness and light, that kind of opposition. So I think you're right. I think that this is just as I was thinking, what shall we talk about today? I was really having trouble. Monica. Oh, I'm sorry, I cut
I'm
someone
sorry,
off.
I was just gonna say, let me ask one question, and then I'll
Yeah.
turn it to Monica. And that is, the other thing here is this whole question in the end of the Wanderers, the 3 strokes are related to time. She saw them all,
Yes.
not singly, but related to time. And are the strokes of the lighthouse related to time? And is this a kind of still moment?
Mhm.
Yes.
An
Yeah.
escape from time?
Mhm.
And I think that wedge of darkness is that kind of escape as well. Ooh, there's so much.
And the other thing is that solitude leads to expansion of the self.
Yes, yes. And
Through the imagination, I think.
it's right. It's a necessary condition almost, I think, in this novel. Okay, Monica.
Well, I'm going to return, because I'm always going to return if there are needle crafts involved, to the fact that she's knitting, and that her knitting is this kind of undercurrent of rhythm. That's the same way that we have an undercurrent of the water in this novel, the same way that we have the lighthouse. And this is a moment, to me, y'all mentioned that part of this section is about her and Mr. Ramsay not being able to sync up. This is a time where she does sync up. She has a moment of being, her rhythm syncs up with the rhythm of the lighthouse. So I think part of what's going on here is we're seeing the rhythm of art, the rhythm of creativity, and that's what allows her to have this kind of moment of connection with her surroundings that she's unable to have. It's an interesting contrast with her inability to connect with Mr. Ramsay.
Yes, and I think somebody just put in the chat that her knitting is her art. And so there is that connection there as well. Rebecca.
I just wanted to get back to this. She became the thing she looked at, which I think is extraordinary. And Harriet mentioned it, I put in the chat. I think that's the moment when we start to see that this writer is collapsing subject and object. And the collapsing of subject and object creates an impossibility of domination. And I think that is so exciting to think about. It's in her reflective moment when she's able to be the thing she looks at, rather than to try and capture it as an artist or own it or any of that. And I was thinking back to the earlier chapter we read on subject and object and the notion of reality, which is Mr. Ramsay's subject. So
Right.
that Lily is supposed to think about, tells Banks to think about his work, and then he talks about the table at that moment with the subject and object and the nature of reality. And yet, instead of writing about that, instead of philosophizing about that, she actually lives it. She experiences that moment on a visceral and real level. And I think as the daughter of a mother who knit all the time, the time, I can say that because she had that knitting in her hand, you never looked at her and thought, she's my mother. She is only a mother. And she had a book in her hand at all times also with the knitting. But it is that moment of they are maintaining their thread to their own identity and their artist identity. Absolutely. And so it provides her. And there's even this moment when she says on, I don't have the same pages, but she says later, I won't go to the next section, but she talks about wool gathering.
Mhm.
So there's a different way of creating creativity. It's as if Welty is actually creating the web of her writing as she's writing it. And this is a different perspective. It's not the philosopher. It's not even the novelist. It's something completely new. And I think that's extraordinary. And that third stroke is different than Perseus because it's light. The third stroke is
Right.
light. And so if it's this wedge of darkness, that third stroke is hers. And I remember reading somewhere that when you have 3 points, you're never going to have closure because the 3 points are always going to create tension. So it's not like coupling in a marriage. There's always more than 1 point. So I loved that was there, that the 3 does that so much. I'll be quiet.
Well, you were making me also think about the fact that, so, I mean, in that scene, it's Mrs. Ramsey looking, and throughout so much of the window, Mrs. Ramsey is being looked at. And there again, that play with subject and object, I think, is so rich. Jessica.
Well, I just wanted to say, Melissa Fox put a really wonderful comment in the chat. Melissa, would you like to talk about it? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I really loved your comment. If you want to mention it to the group, I thought it was fabulous.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, I was just curious about doubleness in relation to Mrs. Ramsey, how she is the wedge of darkness and is the lighthouse. She's a wife and a mother. She's the woman in the window, but also the woman Lily Briscoe is painting in the window. She's looking in, but she also seems to be discovering her own self. So I feel like there's a layer of her learning about herself too. But then I was also wondering about Mr. and Mrs. Ramsey. Do we ever learn their first names? Because then they also seem like a kind of double, like the flip sides of a coin. That's all.
And I'm just completely struck. Do we ever learn their first names? And I don't know the answer to that right offhand. And I feel like I should, but I'm afraid I don't. That's so fascinating because they're defined by those roles. And so much of their internal life is about escaping those roles, Mr. Ramsey thinking about how he could go and hike for hours with just bread and cheese in his pocket, but you can't do that if you're married with 8 children. And then with Mrs. Ramsey and, the wedge of darkness and the lighthouse. Oh, that is a great question. I'm going to have to think about that and figure that out. I wanted to look at just one more passage from this section, because this section I thought was so remarkable. And this is still about the light, but it's toward the end and somebody's already referred to it. I mean, it's just this absolutely beautiful passage in which she's seeing, she's again still thinking about the light, and she says, the steady light, the pitiless, the remorseless, which was so much her yet so little her, which had her at its beck and call. She woke in the night and saw it bent across their bed, stroking the floor. But for all that, she thought, watching it with fascination, hypnotized, as if it were stroking with its silver fingers some sealed vessel in her brain, whose bursting would flood her with delight. She had known happiness, exquisite happiness, intense happiness, and it silvered the rough waves a little more brightly as daylight faded and the blue went out of the sea, and it rolled in waves of pure lemon, which curved and swelled and broke upon the beach, and the ecstasy burst in her eyes, and waves of pure delight raced over the floor of her mind. And she felt, it is enough. It is enough. It's just It's just an exquisite passage, but it also seems to me to refer back to one earlier with Lily Briscoe, who is watching Mrs. Ramsay, as she's actually watching Mr. Ramsay bearing down and retreating, and Mrs. Ramsay sitting with James in the window, and she's looking at the cloud and the tree, and she's thinking how life, from being made up of little separate incidents which one lived one by one, became curled and whole like a wave, which bore one up with it and threw one down with it, there with a dash on the beach. So we have, I mean, Mrs. Ramsay is now the ocean. I mean, so, you know, we've just in the course of this very short few pages had these lyrical passages in which Mrs. Ramsay's sense of self is being captured for us. And I'm just curious again about your thoughts about this passage. Ray.
Well, one could certainly think about a sexual
Right?
interpretation,
Mm-hmm.
but to me that would belittle it, because this is the kind of experience that maybe goes beyond that. And I think it's cultivated in Christian mysticism, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a practitioner of Zen Buddhism, and it has a name there, which is samadhi or kensho, and it's a sudden epiphany,
Mm-hmm.
like the experience of God is said to be. It's overwhelming, it's out of nowhere, it's intuitive. So I tend to think of it that way.
I mean, it is an epiphany, and it's orgasmic as well. And Harriet.
I'm thinking ecstasy and delight, and the on the floor of her mind, and the satisfaction in the sense that it is enough, and at the same time, Mr. Ramsay is looking over at her and feeling as if he's intruding on her aloofness with his desire to protect her, as if she needs protection when she's this mind that is going places that that maybe he would like to go. And I'm thinking back to the Lord comment, and also to Mrs. Ramsay's sense that they must marry. That is her tendency to want to go to conventional places about love, while she's also somebody who understands separateness better than anybody in the book, and that side of her that is trying to speak the language of conventional social life, and it's embedded in her desire to see everybody married and conventionally happy with this union, which we're looking at and saying, how far apart can these people be?
Yeah, that desire, though, it's part of her desire to connect, for connection too. And it is the kind of conventional way of connecting. But you're right. I mean, it's one of many remarkable juxtapositions in the novel. I mean, it is enough. It is enough. He turned and saw her. She was lovely, lovelier now, but he could not speak to her. He could not interrupt her. but he wanted urgently to speak to her. I mean, just that juxtaposition between that kind of epiphany and then suddenly Mr. Ramsey's intensive need. And she responds to it, for he wished she knew.
Right, exactly.
Her,
She, she recognizes what he needs and
gives it to him. Mhm.
And his line about her is she was aloof from him now in her beauty, sadness, just at the moment when we're experiencing her ecstasy.
Exactly.
So
that failure of understanding.
Failure of looking, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Monica?
Well, I just noticed an even stronger contrast on the page before, right before she has this ecstasy. First, Mr. Ramsey's thinking about Hume stuck in a bog, and then he cannot help noting as he passed the sternness at the heart of her beauty. I mean, this next page is anything but stern.
Right.
And he notices, right, that as she's knitting with firm composure, slightly pursing her lips, so she's like doing like a weird cable or something that requires some attention. And you're probably going to make a funny face. But it's the page before, I just noticing the word stern is really striking.
Yeah.
But when he says stern, she's just been thinking, there is no reason, order, justice, but suffering, death, the poor. And that's when he says he sees the sternness, I think.
And she's described as severe.
Yeah.
And she's knitting the stocking for the boy at the lighthouse because she's thought about all the class contradictions and how and she has empathy and she extends herself to the lighthouse. So it's a real moment of her understanding of the world as vastly larger than his. And so I think it is, Monica, that word really stuck out to me too, stern. It was,
and it's at the heart of her beauty.
It was a misreading because it was much more how big her heart was, how compassionate she was.
Okay, I'm going to, we can spend the entire hour on section 11. I'm going to suggest that right now we jump ahead to section 14. And it's, I don't in any way mean to dismiss the next sections. And Lily Briscoe saying, so that is marriage, which we've already touched upon. But section 14, especially if we're thinking about just in the context of Welty, because there are some really direct references in Delta Wedding to this very particular section, including the refrain from the Ballad of Sam Hall, damn your eyes, and that's and I'm sure many of you may have looked that up as well. I mean, it's a ballad, it's being sung by a completely unrepentant murderer as he goes to the gallows. And it's a refrain that crops up in Delta Wedding. And again, children singing it. And also the lost brooch, I never know how to say that word. The lost brooch, which shows up in Delta Wedding as well. We have in this section. And I guess in this section, one of the things I've always, oddly, it reminds me of a Catherine Ann Porter story called The Grave. Many of you are probably very familiar with that as well, where, you know, it's about children, and I'm thinking of Andrew and Nancy, who are not adults yet, and who really are not quite ready to be adults yet. And yet they are exposed to this the more adult world of romance and marriage that we see with Paul and Minta. So I think the juxtapositions in this section are fascinating. But I would like to start us with Nancy's vision. It's on page 75 in this, where she's crouching down over that pool. And this is Nancy, who has gone off. She's left after lunch, as it says, to escape the horror of family life. and she's going to her attic. And instead, Minta says, no, come with us, and grabs her hand. And there again, wait, what does Minta's holding Nancy's hand mean? Because that's, it's Nancy's asking, what is it that she wanted? Is it that? And what was that? And here there emerged from the mist, as Nancy looked down upon life spread beneath her, a pinnacle, a dome, prominent things without names. But when Minta dropped her hand, as she did when they ran down the hillside, all that, the dome, the pinnacle, whatever it was that had protruded through the mist, sank down into it and disappeared. So maybe we can start there with Nancy and then move into the world in her pool in a minute. Any thoughts about that? If not, we can move. We can move to the whole world. And this is just such a fascinating passage to me. It seems almost kind of self-enclosed in the novel. Nancy looking under the pool, thinking about that all power sweeping savagely in, inevitably withdrawing, hypnotized, and the two senses of that vastness and this tininess. And there again, we have another of those oppositions. But I think it's just feeling that kind of intensity of feelings, which reduced her own body, her own life, the lives of all the people in the world forever to nothingness. John.
There we go. Thank you. One thing that strikes me about the chapter as a whole is that it begins with a parenthesis and it ends with a parenthesis.
Yes.
And the answer to the question at the end of chapter, what is it? It would be 13.
Yeah.
Is in the answer to that question is chapter 15.
And I love a chapter. That's one answer to a previous question.
Yeah, I have to, and I know I don't think it has anything to do with it, but chapter 15 reminded me of as I lay dying, and the chapter that's one sentence, my mother was a fish.
Right.
And the one sentence chapter here, but it seems to me that this, and you alluded to it, that chapter 14 is out of time. It is describing things that are not going to happen until later. And why and Mrs. Ramsey doesn't know where the children are and and who is out with Paul and Minta. And she's trying to figure out when was the last time she saw Nancy, and did she see him leaving or with them, and she's going through that in her mind, and then somebody comes in and answers all these questions, but she still doesn't know the answer to them, I don't think. And I think it's a remarkable chapter, and it makes me wonder why Ms. Woolf did this insert this way, and allows us to get this understanding of what happened, before they ever come back to the dinner.
Right. And certainly Mrs. Ramsey, this is the more conventional side of her. I mean, she's worried about Paul and Minta being out together because Minta's parents might hear about it. So it might, it might reflect badly on Minta in terms of societal perspectives. But I think that's an interesting question, really, John, about we're stepping away from Mrs. Ramsey. We're stepping away from Mr. Ramsey here. This is all really happening aside from the kinds of questions about that Mrs. Ramsey has about who's gone, which is also about fear. I mean, at some point she says, you know, it couldn't be a complete Holocaust of losing them all. It's better if 4 of them have gone out because they can't possibly all die. But this is really taking outside. And so it is a very different section of the window, but it's about the sea. You know, the word, there's a repetition of the word fatal in the discussion of the sea, the tide coming in. And there is this very odd interlude of Nancy's looking into the pool. Harriet.
Yeah, I'm interested in the looking again, and it's
Looking, yeah.
looking and imagination. That is, I think it's a very similar scene to the wedge. That is, Nancy is disconnecting from what's going on around her by looking at the natural world, and then something happens which is more than looking. That is brooding. She changed the pool into the sea and made the minnows into sharks and whales, and cast vast clouds over the tiny world by holding her hand against the sun, and so brought darkness and desolation like God himself to millions of ignorant and innocent creatures, and then took her hand away suddenly and let the sun stream down. I'm thinking about the connection between perception and imagination, and then imagination as being delusional, and the way in which we're looking. Again, this question of perception and what's knowable and how accurate perception is, and this is a child's imagination. I don't know. I know how old you think Nancy is. I wondered about that, but I'm just noticing that we're not looking. We're doing more than looking here. We're entering and creating an imaginative world and power in it. There's place and power in the universe is delusional, and yet delightful in this child.
And I think the language that Woolf uses is almost biblical there. So this idea of power and creation, and then the reference to God. I mean, it's again thinking back to the hands of the Lord. I mean, you know, she becomes the hands of the Lord in that scene, which is just fascinating. So I think that, I think it is that sense of, again, you know, we're getting little instances of the power of artistic imagination, and that an artistic imagination is not just about looking at something static from a distance, but it is about engagement over and over again, I think, in the novel. So the artist is not, I mean, it's not looking in some sort of subject-object notion, but it's looking as a form of intimacy, as a form of connection that we see here. So I do want to ask about the lost brooch. Thoughts on that? Oh, and I'm sorry, Ray, I didn't see that you had your hand up there.
Oh, thank you. I was thinking of the pleasure that I would have had if I'd been working with a patient who offered that kind of dream. And that's the way I might want to approach it. And what I was taught to say was, what comes to mind about the dream? So you don't go to a file and find what the dream means. You ask the patient and they create the meaning. And I imagine there would be a lot of creativity in that interpretation.
Right. So the lost brooch, thoughts about it? Yeah, Rebecca.
Well, of course, the Delta wedding
Of
connections,
course.
the obvious connections. But I was, the line before we get into Minta cried out that she had lost her grandmother's brooch. There's a moment of Andrew and Nancy is very trans gender fluid moment, because
Right.
it's all the same. It irritated Andrew that Nancy should be a woman, and Nancy that Andrew should be a man. And they tied their shoes very neatly and drew the bows rather tight. I think
love
that this
sentence.
just shows her humor, which does come out in places throughout this
Right.
section that we read today. But
Oh,
it also,
hugely.
there's a Gertrude Stein quote, what's the use of being a little boy if you grow up to be a man? And I think that it's a brilliant insight. Woolf is having this insight about the same time, actually. There's not that different in time, that much difference in time. And the being a woman, being a man, every time there's a scene of conventional sex in Welty, she really interrogates it and she dismisses it in a way. So they've just seen
Right.
Paul and Minta kissing, and then it's like, oh my goodness, look, we're gonna have to grow up to be a man and a woman.
Yeah.
And then the loss happens.
Right.
So I'm not sure what to make of it as the pairing there, why it happens in that order, but I find that interesting.
Right. I think so. I mean, and it's interesting that they Paul and Minta kissing, probably. Even that is not, they haven't actually seen an actual kiss, but I think it's the passage that you just looked at that makes me think so much of Porter's The Grave, and that sense of wanting to reject that. And that, and Nancy's outraged and indignant. And then when Minta loses the brooch, I mean, it gives Paul an opportunity to act the hero. And he imagines they can't find it, and he imagines going out to buy her a new one, wanting to make this right. But earlier in that, we shall be cut off, Minta shrieked, suddenly terrified, as if there were any danger of that. This is Andrew. It was the same as the bulls all over again. She had no control over her emotions, Andrew thought. Women hadn't. The wretched Paul had to pacify her. The men, Andrew and Paul, at once became manly and different from usual, took counsel briefly, and decided that they would plant Rayleigh's stick where they had sat and come back at low tide again. But I think it's a continuation of the dynamic that Rebecca just pointed out of this, so for a while, so you have them rejecting this, you have Andrew saying, no, I don't want this. And suddenly it's contagious, now suddenly he's becoming very manly. So it is really a chapter that outside of the house is playing in a number of ways with all of those issues having to do with marriage and intimacy and men and women that we see Woolf working with in the window, in the home. But we see how pervasive it is with Paul and Minta, who of course must marry, and even with Andrew and Nancy. And then I know we're almost out of time. We have 1 minute. But in chapter 16, we are back to Mrs. Ramsey again. And this is where she says, that after all, Holocaust on such a scale was not probable. They could not all be drowned. And again, she felt alone in the presence of her old antagonist, life. And then a little bit further on, when Rose, and especially Rose, but Jasper and Rose are picking the jewelry, Mrs. Ramsey is thinking about the fact that what Rose felt is out of proportion to anything that she actually was. And Rose would grow up and Rose would suffer, she supposed, with these deep feelings. And she said she was ready now and they would go down. So we're back to after we have that moment of ecstasy that Mrs. Ramsey has experienced and has said, it's enough. We have her back into this pessimistic view. I mean, this wrestling with life and this sense that, what awaits anyone who feels deeply is going to be suffering. And then she comes down the stairs like a queen, which is another of those absolutely beautiful passages that is so rich. And we see her bowing her head slightly as if she accepted what they could not say, their tribute to her beauty. And then she smells dinner burning. I mean, it's another of those juxtapositions. So thank you all today. I mean, I think that we have run out of time. And apparently, except for section 15, we needed a whole hour to talk about each of these sections today. Section 15, we could have probably gotten through, but everything else is just so rich and so wonderful. And what we have ahead is going to be every bit as rich. So I'll look forward to next week.
Yes, we'll do the window sections 17 through 18. Thank you all.
Yes.
See you next Monday.
All right.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful week and enjoy your immersion in the Lighthouse. All right. Take care.